be like if you took away all the buildings, took away the streets, took away all the cars, and returned it back to what it once was.
Now, take a journey back into time, back into an unimaginable past.
This was a central area, we call it Dinosaur Turnpike, where dinosaurs could have walked from New Jersey to Africa.
A new world, seen from a startling new perspective.
New York City was the birthplace of the Atlantic Ocean. It's where the continents began to rip apart.
The works of man, exposed. We peel back the layers of time and discover lost treasures from a hidden past.
The first time when I lined this up, it was a huge aha moment. This is it. This is our piece of history.
We plunge underground to explore a secret world.
If either City Tunnel number 1 or City Tunnel number 2 was to collapse and fail, it would be a catastrophic event.
And the past collides into a future beyond prediction.
That world will look nothing at all like the planet we now inhabit. Nothing.
A super city. New York. We begin here, at the site of New York's worst calamity, Ground Zero at the former World Trade Center. Geologist Charles Margarian is taking advantage of a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, a chance to examine the renowned bedrock on which the city was built.
There we go. New York City as a center of commerce and culture, to me, is a derivative of the fact that New York City is situated at the convergence of many, many different geological belts. And these different geological belts, through time, have created this unusual topography that created this wonderful harbor environment and construction of enormous buildings and a spectacular infrastructure that could not have been done elsewhere.
There are only a few super cities on this planet. Cities that stand as marvels of engineering, infrastructure, and commerce. But every super city's success is grounded in its past, on and below the land where it grew. This land acts as a virtual portal into the past. For the story of this city began more than 1 billion years ago.
These rocks originally started out as a sediment on the deep ocean floor. And about 500 million years ago, North America was a large continent known as Laurentia, and it straddled the equator. What is now the eastern coast of North America was actually south of the equator. And what's happened over the last 500 million years is that North America has actually rotated counterclockwise and has drifted northward into its present position.
About 450 million years ago, a chain of volcanic islands collided with what is now North America.
During that event, edge of North America got tucked down underneath that volcanic arc in a huge subduction zone or trench, similar to the modern trenches that we have lining the Pacific today. And in that passage, sediments transformed into new minerals and align themselves into an orientation.
These transformed sediments, known as metamorphic rocks, are the raw materials in the Manhattan bedrock that runs like a spine down the length of the island.
This is a metamorphic rock known as a schist, and in many cases this bedrock is close to the surface, and that really facilitates the growth of tall buildings because that bedrock can maintain load.
This bedrock would define Manhattan's geology. But the story of the creation of New York's terrain was far from over. 250 million years ago, Africa collided with North America, creating a new supercontinent known as Pangaea. In the midst of this geological drama, the first dinosaurs arrived on the scene.
When the dinosaurs first appeared on planet Earth, approximately 230 million years ago, New Jersey would have been deeply landlocked within the giant supercontinent of Pangaea. It would have been directly next to Morocco, and early dinosaurs could have walked from New Jersey to Africa.
Paleontologists like Bill Gallagher have found dinosaur footprints throughout the New York area, particularly in the red sandstone and lava flows just across the Hudson River in New Jersey.
This is a small early dinosaur footprint, shows the typical three-toed pattern, and eventually dinosaurs would grow into these much larger forms with these giant footprints, and these big footprints represent the flowering of dinosaurs into the largest land animals on Earth. This was a central area, we call it Dinosaur Turnpike, where dinosaurs probably migrated through, and since New Jersey was deep in the heart of this giant supercontinent, dinosaurs came through here on their way to other places.
One of the most prevalent creatures in the area was the hadrosaur, the so-called duck-billed dinosaur.
And back of me is the kind of dinosaur that roamed New Jersey's swamplands when New Jersey was a subtropical environment with abundant lush forests, which would have provided plenty of food for this kind of big plant eater. This animal grew up to 24 feet in length, weighing several tons, so it had to have lots of salad for breakfast, lunch, and dinner.
Things were fairly quiet for 50 million years, until the Earth reawoke and the continents began to split apart again.
Thermal activity starts pushing the edge of the continent upward. By then, the Appalachian Mountains were as grandiose as the Alps are today. Thousands and thousands of feet of elevation.
About 180 million years ago, the supercontinent Pangaea divided into two new continents, with Africa and South America separating from North America and Europe.
New York City was the birthplace of the Atlantic Ocean. It's where the continents began to rip apart about 180 million years ago. As the Earth warmed up and you pulled the continents apart, the deeper part of the Earth came up where it's hot. And as that heat comes up, you generate great big lava flows, the ones that covered all of New Jersey. These cliffs, which run along the edge of the Hudson River, from about halfway down Manhattan, 20 miles north, are the edge of the lake that formed as Africa ripped away from North America. And they actually are the lava flows that came out into the bottom of the lake.
During this time, the New York region was a greenhouse environment, perfect for the dinosaurs that swarmed the area, until 65 million years ago.
But all of a sudden, an asteroid 6 miles wide smashed into the Earth at a speed of 35,000 miles per hour. This created a tremendous explosion, which wiped out the dinosaur population in North America, possibly in as short a time as 5 minutes. There is evidence in southern New Jersey in the form of an ejecta layer buried deep under the coastal plain sediments. And this particular ejecta layer of fallout from the impact has been found at over 100 different spots around the Earth.
The continents continued to drift and split apart until around 2 million years ago, what is now the New York area reached its present location. But nature continued to carve and fine-tune the land. Great glaciers pressed down from the Arctic regions across Canada, down through New York and Connecticut. 3 times the ice sheets descended and retreated, carving out massive ravines and riverbeds. The ice scoured out a 300-foot canyon next to Manhattan that eventually became the Hudson River. As the ice sheets enveloped North America, they sucked up the ocean's water, dropping the sea level. This moved the shoreline about 120 miles east of present-day New York.
What you see in Central Park that reflects the passage of the ice is some scoured surfaces where you have striations, lines created by the rocks in the bottom of the glacier, polishing the rock itself and creating a rock surface with a nice sheen on it.
In Central Park, near the baseball fields, teeters a geological curiosity known as a glacial erratic, a boulder brought south by the advancing glaciers tens of thousands of years ago. And the park contains a dozen more of these errant rocks that have held their daring positions for the better part of 20,000 years. During this time, what is now Lower New York State was a prime destination for the immense animal migration that took place as the glaciers pushed Arctic mammals south. Fossil remains of woolly mammoth, long-haired Arctic ox, and white bears have all been found in the area. As the climate swung back toward warmer temperatures, other strange creatures came migrating up from the south, such as the giant ground sloth, a huge herbivore nearly as big as an elephant. But the animal that would make the greatest impact on the environment was a hairless primate that arrived on the scene between 15 and 20,000 years ago. This new species would transform the landscape in ways much more dramatic than nature ever had. When we think of New York City, we usually think of this one small island, Manhattan, that in reality is only one part of a much larger supercity. Today, encrusted with skyscrapers, it seems like an entirely artificial creation. But appearances can be deceiving.
Manhattan is one of the most transformed places on the planet. It's a place that's changed so much, it's hard to imagine it as a natural landscape. So imagine what Manhattan would be like if you took away all the buildings, took away the streets, took away all the cars, and returned it back to what it once was.
For the past 8 years, ecologist Eric Sanderson has been involved in a research program called the Mannahatta Project, from the Native American name for the island.
Manhattan comes from the Native American word Mannahatta, which means island of many hills.
Sanderson and his colleagues hope to recreate what Manhattan looked like in its natural state before Europeans arrived 400 years ago.
So I was interested in going back to what Mannahatta was like, what the landscape was like before it had been so transformed, when it was a landscape of valleys and hills, of sparkling streams, of wetlands.
To accomplish this mission, Sanderson has employed 21st century technology and 18th century records. The Rosetta Stone of the Mannahatta Project is a British military map dating back to the American Revolution, which is another portal to the past. It is extremely accurate because the British occupied New York for 8 years during the war. In order to defend their position, they needed to designate the location of every hill, stream, and valley on Manhattan. Fortunately for Sanderson, at the time the map was drawn, much of the island was still in its original state.
This is the British headquarters map from 1782. It shows all the original topography of Manhattan Island. The hills, the shoreline, the lakes, and the streams. This is the secret to unlocking the Mannahatta Project.
Like forensic geographers, Sanderson and a team of researchers digitized the 18th century British map into a computer. He then laid the modern street grid on top of the British map. By using common locations and GPS readings, he was able to geo-reference Manhattan's original terrain with today's city grid.
Here we are in Times Square. Using a GPS just like this, I could come to anywhere in the city, stop, look up the coordinates, it's 40 degrees latitude, 73 degrees longitude, and reconstruct what the view was like 400 years ago.
What is now Times Square was surrounded by rolling hills and 3 streams which emptied out into a valley. But there was one thing still missing. The British map gave no real detail about the greenery and vegetation that was on the island. To add the correct landscape to his virtual model, Sanderson went to Inwood Park on the northern tip of the island, the only park in Manhattan that still retains the original trees, rocks, and foliage from pre-colonial times.
To reconstruct what Manhattan's ecology was like, we needed to know more than just the topography. We needed to know about the water, the soils, the rocks. The rocks are important because they tell you how deep the soil is, and that tells you how much the plants can root in and how big the trees can be. Tulip trees, like these large trees that we saw all around me, are the kind of trees that were really characteristic of Manhattan. They can grow 80, 100 feet tall. They can live 300, 400 years.
Sanderson recorded digital images of the scenery. And once he added the correct foliage to his depiction of Times Square, he had a complete picture. Today, Times Square is an asphalt magnet for millions of tourists and residents who commute above and below its streets. But these streets are another portal that allows us to go back in time. "400 years ago, Times Square was a swamp, populated by red maple trees with a beaver pond in the middle. This animation, based partially on data collected by the Manhattan Project, allows us to virtually fly over the island, now stripped of the works of man.
From the bird's eye view, we'd see the rolling topography of Manhattan. These were low hills, 100 feet high, 200 feet high up in the northern part of the island, and then flatter plains covered with forests, like in Greenwich Village, coming down to sandy beaches along the Hudson River shore and wrapping all the way down to the Battery.
The venerable neighborhood of Murray Hill was once a lush area of rolling hills and streams. The Harlem River, which separates the island of Manhattan from the Bronx, was a pristine waterway, rich with fish and marine mammals. The Upper West Side, today home to some of the city's most renowned musicians, actors, and writers, was a verdant natural paradise. Now that Sanderson has remapped every square mile of Manhattan, he has a much different view of the island.
An amazing thing when you look at this map is how transformed the terrain is from what it was 200 years ago, 400 years ago, 2,000 years ago. All of these hills that you see here, except for a few features in Central Park and a bit up in the northern part of the island, have been flattened, filled in, and totally changed. People sometimes think New York doesn't have any topography because it's hard to see it when you're here. It's because the topography that was here has been muted. The valleys were filled, the hills were leveled. It's not totally flat, but it's not like the topography it was before.
Battery Park, the southern tip of Manhattan. In 2006, while monitoring construction of a subway tunnel, archaeologists discovered 4 sections of a rock wall about 10 feet underground. The wall appeared to be part of a fort. But how old was it, and who had built it? Since the days of New Amsterdam, the Dutch, British, and Americans all had occupied forts on the southern tip of the island.
There had been several walls or batteries that protected the fort in Lower Manhattan over the years. So we didn't know which section we had. Was it a Dutch section? Was it a British section? Was it an American section? So what we did was we went back through time, through history, looking at the historic maps with our modern day coordinates. It sounds like it would be maybe a simple task. We have coordinates, we know how these things are related to one another, we know what size they were. But historically, map making wasn't as precise as it is today. So it actually is a bit of an exercise in trying to find a best fit.
Finally, they found a match. A map drawn between 1766 and 1767, showing a seawall that had been built by the British.
The first time when I lined this up, it was a huge aha moment. This is it. This is our piece of history. So what we have here is our 4 sections of wall lined up, overlaid showing us that, in fact, these were the sections of the wall that we had uncovered, and that they all were built during that British pre-Revolutionary War period of New York City. And to actually have physical evidence of this dating back to the 1700s is really incredible.
But the maps also provided another revelation.
One thing for sure is that our shoreline back in the 1760s was much further inland than it is now.
This wall is a time portal, for it connects us back to the past when the dimensions of this super city were very different than they are now. When an explorer named Henry Hudson sailed into New York Harbor in 1609, he was looking for the Northwest Passage to China. But he accidentally discovered one of the biggest and best natural harbors on Earth.
If you look at the harbor today with its man-made coastlines and the air full of helicopters and planes and the harbor full of commercial shipping, it's very hard to imagine what was here 400 years ago. 400 years ago, this harbor was a natural wonder. It was full of whales spouting and seals and porpoises and sea drums and striped bass and sturgeon. Every European who wrote about sailing into New York Harbor commented on how as soon as you enter the harbor, you get this incredible sweet smell.
What's remarkable about this side of the Hudson River is it looks exactly the way it would have looked when Henry Hudson sailed up the river in the 1600s. You close your eyes, you can imagine you're just sailing up the river.
But before the Europeans arrived, there had been humans living in the area for thousands of years. The dominant Native American group in the area was the Lenni Lenape, a loose confederation of tribes that lived in what is now New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the Hudson River Valley and New York Harbor. Utilizing the many caves of what we now call Inwood as a home base, they traveled south throughout Manhattan to make use of its rich streams, inlets, and forests.
400 years ago, the most important place on Manhattan for people was actually right around here in Inwood Park. There was continuous fresh running water, the cold springs. There was good protection because of the topography, protecting them from the winter winds. And it was close to the whole Hudson River Valley, so they could communicate with other people and other cultures that way.
Though the native people are gone, the diagonal path they created running down Manhattan's length still remains. These days, it's called Broadway. From the earliest days, one of the staples of Manhattan was a humble shellfish. It is safe to say that New York owed its survival to the oyster.
The waterways were full of oysters. They were all around Staten Island, all around the Brooklyn and Queens coast. These two islands out here, which are now known as Liberty Island and Ellis Island, were called Great and Small Oyster Island because they had tremendous oyster beds around them.
New York City began as New Amsterdam, a Dutch trading post. But it quickly became one of the New World's busiest ports.
The Dutch were a very commercial maritime people, and they knew a good port when they saw one. And they immediately recognized that New York Harbor, with all of its coastlines and waterways, was just an ideal harbor.
The only way to move things around in 1700 was by water, was by ship. And an island in the middle of a great harbor was like the equivalent of having prime interstate access.
As the city grew, the combination of a deep natural harbor with a river feeding inland made Manhattan a perfect location for the colonial merchants.
In 1766, we would have found a deep natural channel sitting right up next to Lower Manhattan, making it the perfect port, making it where you could sail from Europe and tie your ships up without having to anchor out. You can see that the orientation of the streets as we know them today in Lower Manhattan was all driven by the water, where the deep channel was.
The Battery Park Wall, discovered in 2006, was built on what was once the coast of the island. Soon the city grew outward, a metropolis that owed its very existence to garbage. In the beginning, landfill was used to construct shipping docks, but as real estate filled up, more land was created to provide new building space. The first type of landfill was garbage. The locals would bring their weekly offering down to the docks and dump it behind retaining walls, cribbing structures, and even ships, which were eventually filled in.
It was not just dirt. Landfill back then was whatever junk or garbage anybody could throw in. So they would put out a call to the community to get rid of your trash, and you can actually see changes in the types of debris that you find in the fill.
Miles of landfill have been added to the Manhattan coast since the Dutch founded the city in 1625.
Just to orient yourself, here's Liberty Island and Ellis Island, Liberty Island and Ellis Island, and here's Lower Manhattan. And the first thing that strikes you is you can see how much smaller Lower Manhattan was in 1766 than it is today.
Because of landfill, the Hudson River's path today is much narrower, which has had a dramatic effect on the river's current.
Even though the water pretty much looks the same as it did hundreds of years ago, what's happened is the morphology and the shape of the river has changed dramatically.
Geophysicist Robin Bell and a team of scientists have spent 2 years mapping the river, from the Verrazano Narrows, 150 miles north to the Troy Dam. Their sonar map revealed that the expanding coastlines of Manhattan and New Jersey have radically changed the navigable channels of the river.
Since about 1920, as development has crept in from both sides, the river has gotten deeper, and as the currents have gotten faster, tons and tons of mud and sediment have been removed from the bottom of the river and exported out to the ocean.
The narrower channel has increased the speed and force of the current, scouring the bottom of the river. Eventually, this scouring effect may remove enough sediment to expose both the Lincoln and Holland tunnels, putting them at risk of flooding or collapse. In recent years, steps have been taken to alleviate the erosion effects of the stronger river currents. But the health of the Hudson and New York City still hangs in the balance.
Today in the river, we have very much controlled the processes, but it will continue to be a dance between the natural processes and the human processes.
In the 400 years since the Dutch established the colony of New Amsterdam, the natural terrain of Manhattan has been flattened and expanded. But in the early 1800s, the very face of the city was set in stone. These two men are on a treasure hunt.
Okay. We're still online. Okay, try coming back this way, because we're about.
I think it's going to be right about here.
They are searching for a small iron marker, tangible evidence of one of the most important developments in the history of New York City, the design of the city's street grid plan.
So that tree right there is that big one right over there.
I think that's right.
For several years, they have combed Central Park for one of the elusive markers.
We've looked at so many locations and they've been empty. Either we can't find them or there's nothing there, the rock's been destroyed, but we have a few more left and we have a few places that are covered in dirt, so let's keep our fingers crossed. Maybe there's still something out there. It might be under a little bit of grass, it might be buried. There we're going to use the magnetic locator and just wave that around and it'll make some noise when we find something with iron.
Just come through this
Head over this
here.
direction.
All right. All right.
As soon as I get in a clearing, I can get a reading.
All right.
Okay,
Let's see what we got here.
right over here. All right, we're still online. Go.
What is this?
Look at that. Holy
Looks like
smokes.
we got a bolt. An
Well, it's a
iron
bolt.
Their discovery is more than just a historical artifact.
Like he called for.
For this small iron bolt is also a portal to the past. New York, 1805. The city was running out of room. Most of the city's 100,000 residents were crowded into the lower part of Manhattan. The rest of the island was farmland, dotted with a few structures. In 1807, Mayor DeWitt Clinton proposed a plan to turn Manhattan's farmlands into a metropolis. The natural hills and valleys of the island would be leveled. The green paradise stripped of most of its natural features. An island turned into a single, massive rectilinear layout. This design would come to be known as the grid, and it would set the groundwork for the development of a supercity.
When you look at the grid system, it was really a statement, because back then, some American cities, Washington, D.C., for example, were still using the more European tradition of tending to follow the land and building circles and streets that went at angles to each other. And New York really chose a rather mechanical approach to just making everything straight, not really trying to go with the contours of the land, but just overcoming the land.
But what did that original plan look like? What did New York look like during that transition from paradise to city? Today, the most precise record of the early city plan is found in the so-called Randall Farm Maps. The maps depict the exact terrain of Manhattan block by block, marking boundary positions with iron spikes set in stone monuments.
So that leaves us 6th Avenue.
Today, geographer Reuben Rose Redwood and surveyor Lemuel Morrison are using the Randall maps to understand how the city has changed over the last 200 years.
Well, what we're looking at here are the original copies of the Randall Farm Maps, which depict Manhattan Island approximately around the year 1819 or so, before many of the streets were actually constructed. But here you can see that in the map, he has the streets and avenues of the grid plan superimposed on the pre-grid landscape with the various hills and property boundaries, streams and buildings that were there at the time.
What is fantastic about these maps to me is the connection to the past and how what you're seeing here, except for the grid, doesn't exist any longer. I can only imagine this was a beautiful land.
The key to their mission is locating some of the iron bolts set in stone back in the early 1800s to mark the intersections of the planned streets.
It's important to find the markers because they're the last physical remainder of this grid plan as it was planned. As surveyors, what we do is we retrace the steps of the original surveyor. From my own personal standpoint, it's a connection to the past. This is my city, I love it, but the only thing you see are the buildings. The bolts are the connection to that past. They were there before the buildings, and they were there what took a theoretical idea of this grid and actually put it on the ground.
Incredibly, at least one of these markers survived nearly 2 centuries of construction and development in Central Park.
One reason to look in Central Park is because the streets and avenues that were originally part of the grid plan were never actually constructed. And so that's one of the only places where we would still find these monuments and bolts today.
The marker they found was as described, a square iron bolt set in lead in the exact location where it should be.
It is fantastic. The GPS is telling us that we're well within the limits we expected for the coordinates of this position.
It says that we're right at the corner of what would have been 65th Street and 6th Avenue. So it matches up perfectly.
When the grid plan was laid out in the early 19th century, there were opponents to its rigid conformity.
The Manhattan grid is both one of the most loved and most hated city plans in the world. Critics often blame the grid for all of the ills of modern life, while proponents argue that it laid the foundation for the city's future prosperity. And in a sense, they're both right.
The grid has been one of the few constants in the ever-changing metropolis. Aside from Lower Manhattan, the only street that was allowed to deviate from the plan was Broadway.
There were a few changes, streets that were added, open spaces that were removed from the original plan. But by and large, the streets and avenues are in the same locations today as they were when Randall surveyed them.
The advantages of the grid, first of all, was that it made real estate development to some extent simpler because you had equal-sized parcels, you were building on right angles. It was a great way to develop the island. Was it the most aesthetic way? Undoubtedly not, but it was probably the most efficient way. It is actually a good way to keep the urban landscape very lively because you have a lot of streets, you've got a lot of pedestrians. The disadvantage of the grid has turned out in this century to be that it's a very hard way to deal with traffic. But beyond that, in terms of just the feel of the cityscape, it gave you very long sight lines, and it created a user-friendly kind of city. It was easy to navigate around for strangers or visitors.
If you want to see what Manhattan would have been like without the grid, go to Greenwich Village. Greenwich Village has the original street plan, which makes it much more charming and much more difficult to get around than the rest of Manhattan. Of course, the whole look of Manhattan, the skyscrapers and the monuments, has been designed based on the grid so that you have these vistas looking down long, straight streets.
What's wonderful about the New York City grid is that it provides so much open space. We tend to think New York, Central Park, that's our great park. Our great park is the street system. It's 50% of the city itself, and it provides these wide avenues and streets that go river to river that give you an understanding of where you are at all times. You walk out in that street and you can see the space at the end of the short streets. You look up the avenues, you can't see the end of them. You know you're going north-south because those are the avenues. So it's a very clear system, and you can get a unique neighborhood that is limited to a block, and the next one's very different, and it can change and shrink over time and still retain an organization to it that gives a sense of the city. And it allows for diversity. It's almost like a piece of music, like a piece of jazz. It is a wonderful system that is unique. New York, no place like New York.
When they adopted the grid, city planners had projected that Manhattan could support 1 million people. Today, more than 1.5 million people live on the island. The island of Manhattan. The iconic heart of New York City was developed in 3 major steps. First, the island grew out as landfill added massive amounts of ground covering up the original and natural boundaries of the island. Then this new land was mapped and a huge grid applied, giving form to the natural function that drove commerce and everyday life. Buildings began to cover every available inch of the island, with only a few environments preserved. But by the end of the 19th century, the island was getting too crowded, and the third and final phase of inhabitation began.
The buildings that were constructed were bearing wall masonry, brick, brownstone buildings with wood joists, and so there are limits to the size of buildings you could build.
Man had built out and across. Now there was only one way to go: up. So the city began to build taller and taller buildings, but there was a limit to how high they could build. But one key invention made this vertical expansion of Manhattan possible. An invention that truly transformed the face of the city: the elevator.
Of course, the skyscraper depends on a couple of technologies in order to achieve its great height. The first and most important is the elevator, because without the elevator, the limit on heights of buildings is the strength of people's legs and their patience to walk up maybe 4 or 5 stories.
This invention of the elevator freed architects to design buildings as high as technology allowed. Today, Manhattan has what is perhaps the most famous skyline in the world, defined by the clusters of skyscrapers that shape the horizon like a dramatic mountain range.
New York is really the quintessential skyscraper city because Manhattan Island and Lower Manhattan in particular is really unparalleled as a historical definition, really, of what it means to be a place of power, a place of excitement and energy, and the skyline communicates all those things.
Not surprisingly, the land of Manhattan holds the key to the success of skyscrapers, as buildings of this size and complexity need a firm footing. If we could dive below the Hudson River and look at the terrain beneath the city, we would see that the tallest buildings are found above the shallow bedrock in Lower Manhattan and Midtown. Many experts believe that the depth and quality of the bedrock defined where the tallest buildings would be built.
It became important as you started to build skyscrapers to have the good rock at a reasonable depth. If you didn't have it at a reasonable depth, you couldn't commercially build the structure because so much money would go into the foundation.
Skyscrapers must go down and anchor themselves down to bedrock. And the bedrock is great in downtown, and it's great in Midtown, and in between, although relatively flat on the surface, is this great valley of muck.
But other factors have also played a role in the location of Manhattan's skyscrapers.
The value of land is what produces high-rise buildings. The demand for certain locations, high rents, produce high-rise buildings. So as Cass Gilbert, the famous architect of the Woolworth Building, said in the early 20th century, the skyscraper is a machine that makes the land pay.
Look at Chicago. Chicago, one of the great commercial cities of our nation, and where skyscraper construction was actually pioneered 100 years ago. It has no bedrock at all. It's built on a big swamp. But these imaginative engineers and architects 100 years ago figured out a way to build skyscrapers, even though the soil was totally unsuited for it. And if you study why people built skyscrapers in New York, you find that they're trying to be near the great transportation hubs of the city. It happened that those locations also were where there was a lot of bedrock, and that was a happy accident. But it was not the primary reason that they built the skyscrapers where they are.
The skyscraper districts in Manhattan are really the result of economic conditions.
Brian McGrath, an architect and city planner, has constructed a virtual 3D time-lapse recreation that tracks the building trends in Manhattan over the last 100 years. On his graph, each color represents a different era of construction.
When I click on a time period here, 1893 to 1916, you can see the office buildings that were built in Lower Manhattan near the Wall Street area and the buildings that begin to approach Midtown. This is right at the turn of the 20th century. The first skyscrapers in the world are built in Chicago and New York. This is the beginning of the business districts, both downtown and midtown in New York.
One of the most venerable skyscrapers in the city is the Park Row building in Lower Manhattan. Once the tallest building in the world, the Park Row is our portal to the past. Completed in 1899, the Park Row was 29 stories high and 391 feet tall. It accommodated 950 offices and more than 4,000 workers. It also utilized the newly developed all-steel skeleton technology.
The technology of steel cage construction was the thing that really took the lid off tall buildings. It allowed for buildings to exceed the capacities of stone and masonry bearing walls.
One early skyscraper designed with a steel framework was the 285-foot-high Flatiron Building, completed in 1902. Another famous building that utilized this new steel frame construction was the Chrysler Building, completed in 1930. But perhaps the real icon of the city is the Empire State Building. With its completion in 1931, it was the world's tallest building. It towered above all other buildings in the city for 40 years.
In the late 19th century, 8 or 10 stories would have been considered a very tall building. By the 1890s, 20 stories, but by the 1920s, with the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building, 60, 70, 80 stories would be the current limit for tall buildings.
Brian McGrath discovered that the stock market boom of the 1920s resulted in more skyscrapers being built in a 5-year period than at any other time on our planet.
The romance of New York is the Art Deco skyscrapers of the 1920s, and you can see the concentration on Wall Street and in Midtown of that period. The Empire State Building, the Chrysler Building, Rockefeller Center, all the great towers on Wall Street.
The rise of buildings like the Chrysler Building, the Empire State Building in the late 1920s was a representation of the power of American business. And in 1925, New York became the world's largest city. It surpassed London. So New York was, in many ways, becoming the center of the world.
But 4 years later, the stock market crashed and the building bubble burst. In the latter half of the 20th century, architects and engineers developed new construction methods that allowed for taller, relatively lighter buildings.
Right after the war, we get the introduction of air conditioning, the glass curtain wall building, light steel construction, and so you get a whole different new technology of building. And you see very little construction downtown around Wall Street, but you get a huge concentration between 42nd Street and 59th Street in Midtown.
The post-war building boom peaked in 1972, when 16 skyscrapers were completed, including the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, which finally replaced the Empire State Building as the highest structure in Manhattan. The 2 skyscrapers, each 110 stories tall, were engineering marvels. Their construction a striking example of human ingenuity overcoming the limitations of terrain. The site chosen in 1967 was landfill on the western side of Lower Manhattan. But there was a problem. The Hudson River was only a few hundred feet west of the site. Finding bedrock strong enough to anchor the Twin Towers meant excavating down to 70 feet below street level. 70 feet of waterlogged muck.
Remember that the site was all man-made land because it was underwater in 1600. So in essence, you were building the World Trade Center in the river.
Since the foundation would be below water level, the Port Authority proposed building a giant bathtub to keep the water out. In 1967, as a 30-year-old engineer, George Tomorrow was responsible for the construction of the bathtub.
The slurry wall bathtub, as it's commonly referred to, is really a watertight box that's socketed into rock at the bottom, and it holds the river out and holds all the soil out from cascading into the site.
This bathtub became the parking garage underneath the Twin Towers. Each floor of the garage was a horizontal brace that kept the walls from moving inward and the waters of the Hudson River from undermining the foundation.
Once you've built the watertight bathtub, you can then go in the dry down to the top of rock, build your foundations, and build your building completely in the dry, and have a watertight basement for the life of the project.
The World Trade Center bathtub provided a secure foundation for the city's tallest buildings for nearly 30 years, until September 11th, 2001. Manhattan is an island that has been an eyewitness to history. Its terrain has been transformed by the genius and blood, sweat, and tears of countless men and women. But for as long as Manhattan exists, one day and 2 towers will always symbolize humanity at its worst and its best. This was a day when the works of man and the natural landscape were put to the ultimate test. And as they fell, others rose, and still will rise to the occasion. For nearly 30 years, the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center dominated the Manhattan skyline. Until the morning of September 11th, 2001. While rescue workers were frantically searching for survivors, engineers were concerned that the walls of the bathtub would collapse and flood the site, trapping the rescue workers beneath the debris.
If the walls collapsed, the Hudson River could have come into the site. It was terrible. It was a terrible thing to see. And these guys were just going in there trying to rescue people and recover bodies, and I thought they were putting themselves at great risk. That was probably the most troublesome thing at the time to me.
Structural engineer Pablo Lopez was called in to help evaluate the condition of the bathtub.
We knew from the first day that we came down here that we were working with forces that we had no control over. We were basically working with soil, water that's trying to get in at you any way it can, and at the same time a compromised structure which we had no idea how long it would last, what they were doing up above, if that was going to affect it.
It turned out that the wall was broken at 2 places. Other sections had been pushed in about 3 feet. But engineers discovered that the thousands of tons of rubble from the collapse of the Twin Towers had actually served to brace against the force of the Hudson River.
There was an instance when the walls were absolutely unsupported. But then as the debris began to fill the hole, the walls were resupported. So you had this period where the structure was coming down, it was causing the collapse of the parking decks, the walls were totally unsupported, and then debris continued to fill the bathtub and resupported the walls.
This foundation did its job on 9/11. Basically kept the water out, was tight, resisted all the pressures and all the forces from the collapse, and it did its job.
To secure the walls in place, contractors installed a series of high-capacity tiebacks.
Approximately 1,000 of these were put in after 9/11. These tiebacks are the forces which maintain water pressure and soil pressure from pushing the wall inward. And what you have basically is a balance of the water pressure and soil pushing in and the tiebacks pushing out. So these were the emergency stabilization measure that would allow them to remove the debris.
Today, Pablo Lopez and his team are still working to ensure that the foundation for the new Freedom Tower complex isn't compromised, that the bedrock can support the loads from the tower.
You know, a building is only as good as its foundation. If you build a bad foundation, the building could look gorgeous. It's eventually going to have problems. So the foundation is by far the most important element in the structure. So it's a great privilege to be working here, building back something after 9/11.
When it is completed, the new World Trade Center complex will include a memorial to the victims of 9/11, part of which will be a section of the slurry wall from the original World Trade Center.
After 9/11, the slurry wall actually sustained a lot of damage. You can see some areas where you'll see exposed reinforcing. Now in the future, there'll be a lining, a new concrete lining poured up against this wall, which will then be tied into the floor slabs and shear walls of the new buildings. And then there'll be one small section which will be left as is, and that'll be part of the memorial.
Well, to my mind, the recovery of the skyline in Lower Manhattan is of incredible importance. The trauma of 9/11 still marks every New Yorker very, very indelibly. The absence on the skyline is also something that every one of us sees when we look at the harbor view of the bottom of the island. So I think all of the towers that will occupy Ground Zero are very important as a kind of healing and a kind of replacement and a return to normalcy and to the identity of New York as a skyscraper city.
Today we are looking at buildings in a very different way than we did 10 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And that is, of course, in terms of their efficiency and how that they fit into the environmental issues of today. We've also made a dramatic change in terms of the safety of buildings, not just against terrorist activities, but all of those activities of nature, whether they're tremendous hurricanes that we're seeing more and more of these days, or other forces upon a building. And I feel very positive about that because a lot of lives in the future will be saved because of this kind of thoughtfulness.
As the new World Trade Center takes shape, the stability of the foundation of the original Twin Towers serves as a testimonial to the ingenuity and hard work of the foundation engineers.
What we're doing today, of course, is influenced by all of the previous activity on the site. It's very hard to see that. Of course, the normal person walking around would not know that, oh, I'm in the water now, or I'm on hard, fast land. But a building, whether it has to slip through the water to put its foundations down or is directly on the bedrock, it makes no difference. It's got to get to that rock to hold itself down.
Does anybody know the name of the fellow who designed the Leaning Tower of Pisa? They remember what happened to the foundation. And I think that the foundations are absolutely essential to the buildings. The problem that we have as foundation engineers is that people forget how critical we are. Once they get up to street level, they forgot all the grief, and they're starting to talk about the architect and the aesthetics.
The new World Trade Center itself will give evidence to the ability of humans to overcome the challenges of building in one of the most crowded cities on Earth.
I've worked in a lot of cities. It's probably the toughest place from a construction point of view to work. It's the toughest place to build, and it's a very tough place to live. And you better not slow down because you're going to get run down by the guy walking behind you.
The works of man will rise again, but in the end, nature will not be overruled. New York, the quintessential American supercity. The most vibrant urban center in the United States. But why is New York, New York? Why did this, of all islands along the East Coast, become the heart of American commerce, industry, and culture? Why did New York become the nation's largest city rather than Philadelphia or Boston? The answer lies in the land. The raw materials that would allow the region to grow into modern Manhattan. Today, it's difficult to see the natural New York beneath the steel and concrete. But below the surface, another city can be found, a hidden metropolis critical for the survival of millions of people.
In a way, the city could be compared to an iceberg, where only a portion of the effective city is visible to the naked eye. We know the city is building up, you can see that. What's not so obvious is that it's also building down.
Each day, countless commuters travel from New York's outer boroughs and suburbs to Manhattan to work. And most of them arrive and leave underground.
The reason that millions of people can live and work in New York City is the transportation systems below ground, particularly the train lines. About 1.5 million people live here, and about 3.5 million people come here to work every day. And that's a tremendous logistical challenge.
Today, you can take a subway from the upper reaches of the Bronx to Coney Island. But this subway station can also take us on a journey into the past. During the latter part of the 19th century, New York was becoming more and more crowded. Most of the city's nearly 3.5 million people were squeezed into Manhattan. Many residents had moved to the neighboring boroughs of Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Island, and the Bronx. But they still needed to get to Manhattan to work. The challenge was, how do you move massive amounts of people on and off the island?
Well, basically through amazing engineering feats. I mean, they built enormous tunnels under the Hudson River, and they built bridges across the East River and the Hudson River, And they managed to create means of getting a lot of people here every day.
With the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge in the latter half of the 19th century, Manhattan was connected to the other boroughs. But there still remained a pressing need for a more efficient system of getting people to and from the city. By moving the mass transit system underground, city planners were able to relieve surface street congestion. The first underground rail system in New York was built in 1869 and ran on air.
The first subway was actually a pneumatic subway that was built in Lower Manhattan under Broadway, and for a few blocks you had this train that was sucked through this tunnel by a big fan. The fan would blow it down the tube, and then when it reached the other end, it would suck it back. And it actually worked very well. It's considered that it could have actually powered the subways. For political reasons, it was shut down. The boss of New York at that time, Mayor Tweed, Boss Tweed he was called, he didn't want a subway system because he made a lot of money from kickbacks from the streetcar system, which was above ground. For 30 years, New York City didn't have a subway.
Finally, however, in 1904, the first underground rail line went into operation in the heart of Manhattan. The subway system made it possible to live outside Manhattan and still get to work easily and quickly. As new subway lines opened, new neighborhoods grew up around the stations in the outer boroughs. Today, the New York subway is the most extensive public transportation system in the world.
Think about New Year's Eve in Times Square, where hundreds of thousands of people gather in this one relatively small area. Well, how do they do that? Well, they don't drive. They take the subway, and they get there and they leave very easily, very efficiently, without a lot of traffic congestion. It's a subway system that allows them to do that.
But New York's subway system is only one part of the vast underground infrastructure that keeps the city running.
If you were able to look below the surface of New York City with a kind of X-ray vision, let's say to lift all of the buildings off and to begin to see below the surface, you would first go through maybe 30 or 40 feet of absolutely dense infrastructure. This would include the electric distribution, the local water distribution, steam distribution, the subways, the sewers. So it is packed below the streets of New York. A cross-section really looks like the internal workings of a body because every little available space is occupied by some pipe, tube, or conduit.
There are millions of miles of electrical cables, gas mains, telephone cables, water and sewer pipes beneath the streets of New York. Not to mention fiber optic cables, steam pipes, and even pneumatic tubes.
New York City used to have a major pneumatic tube system. In Lower Manhattan, you could drop a little tube with a letter inside it. It would go down this pipe underneath the streets and then come up into another building a few blocks away. It was actually a really great system, and thousands of buildings utilized this pneumatic tube system. But as phones came in and other technology, they decided to abandon this system in the 1950s, so it is no longer used.
The 55-mile-long pneumatic tube system once delivered 200,000 pieces of mail per hour between the post office and downtown office buildings. Today, the remnants of this unique system are just some of the leftover artifacts of Manhattan's underground infrastructure.
If you're walking around here in New York City, you'll occasionally come to a street that's been torn up, and you'll just see an unbelievable quantity of stuff underground. Some of it old and rusty, and even the experts often don't know exactly what the stuff is there for. And you're talking about stuff that might have been buried in 1880 by a gas company that's been dead for 100 years. There's a lot of stuff underground that no one really knows who built it, what it does, and that can be challenging.
To avoid the tangled mess just below street level, the city utilities have been forced to dig deeper and deeper into Manhattan's bedrock. One of underground New York's most unusual features is the 105-mile system of steam tunnels that snake throughout the city from Lower Manhattan to 96th Street.
This steam tunnel is an example of some of the amazing machinery that exists underground New York, but which the average person tends to forget about.
These tunnels, owned and operated by Consolidated Edison, bring steam directly to thousands of buildings, including the Empire State Building, the United Nations, Rockefeller Center, the Metropolitan Museum, and the NYU Medical Center.
Right now we're in one of Con Edison's utilities tunnel. I'm standing next to a 36-inch diameter steam main, and we're roughly 130 feet down below street surface. The idea of the steam system is that you bring steam into buildings for both heat as well as in the summertime. There's actually a number of customers that use the steam system for air conditioning services.
The steam main carries up to 3.1 million pounds of steam an hour.
Now, this is an amazing system. It's powered by about a half a dozen steam generation plants that are kind of studded around New York City. And each one of these is almost like a giant tea kettle. They're these big boilers full of water, and they're heated up by natural gas, and it sends this hot gas through big pipes like this, which in turn go into smaller pipes that go into individual buildings. And it's a very efficient way to do things, much more efficient than each building having an individual furnace or boiler. If you think about the Empire State Building, imagine how large a furnace would have to be to power that building. You know, they don't need to have that. All they have to have is a pipe that hooks into this steam system. It's one of the systems that really makes New York great and makes New York distinctive.
Manhattan is surrounded on all sides by huge bodies of water. But as close as that water is, it is not close enough. On any given day, Manhattan is moments away from dying of thirst.
Manhattan has been chronically plagued by a shortage of water because there are no rivers, so to speak, on Manhattan Island. The water around Manhattan Island is either pure salt water or at best brackish water mixed with salt and fresh water.
Today, this small sign commemorates the location of old New York's most valuable resource, the Collect Pond. For the first 200 years of the city's history, much of the drinking water was provided by this 48-acre lake and the 67 miles of streams that crisscrossed the island. But in addition to being a source of drinking water, the Collect was also a place for residents to wash laundry and tanneries and slaughterhouses to dump their waste. Carcasses of horses, dogs, cats, and even murder victims were found under the water's surface.
By 1800, the situation was becoming chronic. Epic disease, waterborne disease, cholera, yellow fever, fire was a problem. The combination of health, hygiene, sanitation, and fire protection were pushing New York City to a crisis in terms of water supply. There was no water for toilets, there was no water for bathing. They were drinking primarily beverages that had been boiled in one way or another.
The drinking water was so foul that people had to subsist on beer and hot tea.
In New York City, you had these people called tea men who actually sold water on the street. They would bring water in barrels, and then they would sell it. And so people who could afford it would drink this better water called tea water, and poor people would just get whatever they could.
In the early 19th century, a hill adjoining the Collect was leveled and used to fill in the fetid pond.
And then they built right over the top of it. And for 10 or 20 years, everything was fine. The problem was that they didn't fill it very well. It sort of started to stink, it started to settle, and the buildings started to fall down. So it became a poor neighborhood. In fact, it became 5 Points, like 5 Points from the gangs in New York. The only people that lived here were the poor immigrants from the first part of the 19th century. That lasted for 30 or 40 years, and then at the end of the 19th century, a lot of money came in to knock down the old tenement houses and to build big municipal buildings. The New York City courthouse behind me, the tombs, all of this was built so that when Martha Stewart comes here or Puff Daddy comes to get a rain, he comes right here to the side of the Collect Pond.
The loss of the Collect Pond meant the city no longer had a source of fresh water.
So New York began to look to the mainland as a source of water. And that first mainland source that they went to was the Croton River 40 miles north of New York City.
With the completion of the Croton Aqueduct in 1842, the city was now able to provide fresh water to its population of more than 400,000 people. But the city quickly outgrew even Croton's capacity. In the early 20th century, state leaders built one of the largest public works projects ever, bringing in water from the Catskill Mountains and the Delaware River via 2 water tunnels deep below the city. A century later, these tunnels provide about 1.5 billion gallons of water to more than 8 million city residents every day. But experts are now concerned that the water tunnels that slake the thirst of this supercity may be in jeopardy. In the nearly 100 years they've been in service, neither tunnel has ever been shut down for inspection. Engineers fear that if they close the old valves to perform maintenance, they might not be able to turn them on again.
If either City Tunnel number 1 or City Tunnel number 2 was to collapse and fail, literally half the city would be without water. It would be a catastrophic event.
The only solution to this critical problem was to build a 3rd water tunnel, which city officials started in 1970.
City Tunnel number 3 is a series of tunnels, really, that is over 50 miles long. And by the time it's completed in the year 2020, they will have been building on it for approximately 50 years.
City engineers decided to build the tunnel up to 800 feet below street level, even though it's a construction nightmare to build that deep.
It turned out to be more economical because the closer you are to the surface in the city, the more logistically complicated the construction becomes, and therefore the more costly it becomes.
Building the tunnels deep in the bedrock also makes them structurally more stable.
In order to make these tunnels as secure as possible, tunnels that will last as long as possible, you want to build them in absolute solid rock. So they located the tunnels in all cases in an area where they would have at least 150 feet of solid rock above them.
Today, far below the streets of Manhattan, the tunnel builders, known as sandhogs, are completing one leg of tunnel number 3. These sandhogs are some of New York's most unsung local heroes.
We're almost 600 feet down here, and we tunnel this deep for a couple of reasons. One, obviously, so everybody else will leave us alone. We try to be below everything else, like the subway tunnels, for example, and all the utilities. But the other reason is by going deep, coming down from the mountains, the water builds up pressure as it comes down to New York City. Our system is almost entirely gravity-driven. We only pump water in any significant way in 3 parts of the entire city. And one of the ways we get all that water pressure is by tunneling deep.
The tunnel has to be cut through some of the hardest rock in the world, the 450-million-year-old Manhattan schist.
When we say that the tunnels are dug, that's really a figure of speech. This is absolute hard rock mining that's going on.
But there is an upside to boring through this deep bedrock.
The hard rock is really an advantage because as you dig, you are basically creating the tunnel. Nothing's caving in, you don't have to support it. And it's the reason why we've been able to operate tunnels 1 and 2 for decades and decades, really, because they are tunneled in this very hard rock.
When they built the 2 original tunnels in the early 1900s, workers could only carve out about 10 feet of bedrock a day. With Water Tunnel 3, using a hydraulic tunnel boring machine, they've been able to dig an average of 35 to 90 feet a day.
It used to be when we built a tunnel that they set off blasts, and then they would go in with picks or later with drills, and they basically would chip out the rock.
During the construction of the first 2 tunnels 100 years ago, 1 man would die for every mile of progress. Today, the job is substantially safer, but the risks remain.
Digging the tunnel with a tunnel boring machine is obviously also much safer because you don't have to be setting off dynamite in the tunnel all the time.
These tunnels are marvels of engineering. The system that makes up Water Tunnel Number 3 begins 5 miles north of Manhattan, where 2 aqueducts carry the mountain water into the Hillview Reservoir. From there, the 24-foot diameter tunnel travels at a depth of 400 feet under the Bronx. Every 1/2 to 1 mile, riser pipes carry the water up to the city streets. As the tunnel travels through the Bronx, it shadows the old Water Tunnel Number 1. The tunnel crosses under the Harlem River where it connects to Manhattan. It then turns east at Central Park so it can feed both Queens and Brooklyn. There is more than enough natural pressure coming from the reservoirs to force the water 600 feet up from the tunnel to the surface, where it can be distributed throughout the city. With the addition of this tunnel, New York will be assured a flow of fresh water for decades to come, part of the hidden infrastructure that keeps the city alive.
That tunnel will probably be serving the city in some capacity for as long as there's a city here to be served, maybe several hundred years. This underground river will be delivering water for centuries to come.
2009 marks the 400th anniversary of the discovery of New York Harbor by Henry Hudson. As the city heads into the future, how will it meet the challenges of the 21st century? Many experts warn that because of global warming, sea levels are rising, and Manhattan's low elevation puts it at risk.
Lower Manhattan right now is right at sea level. If people are going to continue to work and live in Lower Manhattan with 1 to 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise from global warming in the coming decades, they're going to have to live and work behind levees. There's no way around it. And it's going to start to look like New Orleans. That world, rapidly on its way, arriving largely in our lifetime, will look nothing at all like the planet we now inhabit. Nothing.
As we have seen, Manhattan has fought a 400-year battle with water. That battle could become infinitely more intense.
There are now scenarios that suggest that even a force 2 or 3 hurricane in a situation where you had increased sea level could just devastate Lower Manhattan, parts of Brooklyn, and most importantly, so much of the infrastructure that is below sea level. The subways, the steam tunnels, the electricity would be flooded and potentially cause a disaster in the billions of dollars.
Some experts have suggested an extraordinary solution.
One proposal for preventing an enormous disaster is that we build tidal dams, actually 3 of them, one between New Jersey and Staten Island, one between Staten Island and Brooklyn, and then one up between the Bronx and Queens. So essentially using these 3 dams to cut us off from the open ocean. And these would then, in the case of storms, rise up and prevent the storm waters from coming in and flooding New York. There have been some tidal dams built. There's one in the Thames in England, in Holland they've been built, but I think it would be an enormously expensive and complex project in the tens, 20s of billions of dollars it would be. But I think in many ways, more than the cost, the environmental implications might well be a showstopper.
But impending climate change is not the only challenge this supercity will face in the 21st century.
New York is, I think, reaching a congestion crisis right now. It's both on the streets and it's in public transit. The solutions are different. I think in terms of automobiles, we are going to end up with the same congestion pricing as London and some European cities have started to have. It simply will cost you $10 or $12 if you want to drive into Manhattan in the middle of a workday. That's almost inevitable. On the public transportation side, there's a lot that can be done with very intelligent electronics. Right now, the computer systems that run our subway and really don't run our buses at all could be much more sophisticated, and we could make the subway so that trains can run much closer together. And there are ways also of scheduling buses so that the bus system can be actually much more effective.
In the coming decades, the very concept of a city may be reconceived.
The idea of having everyone in the same building is going to seem quite archaic to kids 25 or 30 years from now. They simply won't understand why everyone has to come and sit in the same building when you can do your work just as well wherever you are. Location and geography are becoming less important in the information age. More so over these next 30 years or so, where we're going to begin to see telecommuting and telepresence solutions that really let us do our work anywhere we want. You can actually have your entire back office in another country and be able to visit it on large screens and see what's going on and talk to people face to face. So in the future, as it becomes less and less important that you physically be in a place to do your work, the city is going to have to redefine itself. It would create a Manhattan that was much more of a tourist destination, a place that the very wealthy keep their second or third or fourth home. And it wouldn't be the same Manhattan that we know and love now.
In the face of such challenges, will New York City survive?
I'm convinced there will be a New York 500 years from now, barring any mass catastrophe. I think it's going to go through some very difficult times, but long term, the assets that made New York a success in the first place, I think, will continue to drive it well.
One of the things that drives us most of all is to be a social animal. We want to come together when we have the opportunity to do all of the most important things we do. And that's why cities exist. That's why people move to them. That's why they want to be there. When people really want to go travel and learn something, they go to our great cities.
Not everybody will live in skyscrapers or work in skyscrapers. Some will abhor them. But if we want to live in a sustainable world, we have to recognize that cities are the future of our civilization. And if we look at New York and some of the great livable cities in Chicago and San Francisco, where land values, real estate prices rise and rise and rise, is because people want to occupy those places.
But ultimately, no matter what changes we bring to the terrain, nature will prevail. Eventually, even the greatest city must succumb to the elements. And the geological forces that created the continents as we know them today are still at work.
The Earth continues to change, whether it's the plates that are moving, or whether it's the climate that's changing, or the sea level that's changing. Those will always interact. Everywhere on our planet, the Hudson River or some exotic terrain, it's going to be a dance between what humans do and what natural systems do. So it'll just continue to be a dance between these two processes.
With the passage of time, the great metropolis will once again be reshaped by the Earth's forces, returning to its primal state in the geologic cycle. According to some projections, the continents will eventually merge into a new supercontinent that encircles what remains of the Indian Ocean. And New York may become, like so many other great cities, lost in the sands of time.